Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We are diving into, well, one of the most frustrating, maybe foundational problems in philosophy, the nature of consciousness.
Yeah.
And, whether our inner experience, what it actually feels like to see red or feel pain, can it all just be physical stuff?
Yeah, it's the hard problem, right?
Yeah.
But today, we're looking at it through the lens of, rigorous logic. Physicalism is the main idea on the table.
The view that everything, including consciousness, is ultimately physical.
Exactly. But we're voting in on two specific, very developed arguments that try to show, logically, why that standard physicalist view why it has to be false.
And just to be super clear, when we say physicalism today, we mean the standard kind of narrow definition used in these debates.
Right.
It's the idea that phenomenal truths, those subjective facts about experience.
Like what it's like.
Yeah, what it's like, are fully grounded in what philosophers call narrowly physical truth.
And that phrase, narrowly physical truths, that's really key here. It's restricted.
How so?
We're only talking about truths about structure and dynamics. Think spatial arrangements, how things move, interact over time, mathematical properties, causal roles, laws of nature.
Okay.
But crucially, these physical facts are defined without smuggling in anything intrinsically conscious or qualitative. No redness built into the physics itself.
Which right away kind of highlights that gut feeling, that intuitive resistance people have.
Yeah.
How does a bunch of colorless atoms, just bumping around according to mathematical laws, how does that suddenly create the vivid subjective experience of seeing, say, bright pink?
Right. It feels like there's a gap.
It really does. It seems impossible, almost.
And that feeling, that impossibility, creates what philosophers call an epistemic gap. A gap in our knowledge, or maybe even in our ability to conceive of how it could work.
So we're looking at two major philosophical arguments that really lean into this gap. The first one is probably the most famous one.
The conceivability argument, often linked to philosophical zombies.
Right. But the one we're maybe focusing more on today, the potentially stronger case, is the newer one.
The inconceivability argument, or I, as we'll call it.
And our mission really is to dig into why some philosophers argue you could rationally reject the first one, C, but still be logically pushed towards accepting the second one, I, if you're arguing against physicalism.
Meaning I might be the more rationally solid anti-physicalist case. That's the claim we're exploring.
Okay, let's start with the classic then. The conceivability argument, C.
All right, so C is built on this idea that seems intuitive at first. What we can conceive of, coherently imagine, tells us something about what's actually possible in reality.
Like conceivability is a guide to possibility.
Exactly. And the argument usually runs in about 4 steps. We'll use P for all the narrow physical truths about our world, everything structural and dynamic.
Okay.
And Q for some specific phenomenal truth, like having that sharp stinging pain experience.
You got it. P is the physics, Q is the feeling.
Right. So step 1 is the big one. C1, P, and Q is conceivable. Meaning we can coherently conceive of a situation, a world even, that is physically identical to ours in every single way. All the P facts are the same, but where the consciousness, the phenomenal experience Q, just isn't there. Q, the philosophical zombie. Looks human, acts human, but there's nothing going on inside. No feeling of pain. Precisely. That's the scenario C1 claims is conceivable.
Now, it's probably important to stress the kind of conceivability we're talking about here. It's not just picturing a zombie movie in your head.
No, absolutely not. It's not about sensory imagination, which can be misleading. Philosophers call it ideal positive conceivability.
Okay, break that down.
It means forming a coherent, positive mental representation of the P and Q situation, and doing it under ideal conditions, so perfect rational reflection, using all our conceptual resources. If an ideal thinker, knowing all of Q, can still coherently conceive that Q is absent.
Then the premise holds it's about whether the physical facts conceptually force the phenomenal facts to be true.
Exactly. C1 says they don't. There's a conceptual gap.
Okay, so that's premise 1. What's next?
Step 2 is the crucial link. C2, if P and Q is conceivable, then P and Q is possible.
Ah, the bridge. From what we can think to what can actually be.
This is the engine of the argument. It connects epistemology, what we can conceive, to metaphysics, what's really possible.
And step 3 follows from that.
Yep. C3, if P and Q is possible, then physicalism is false. Because if it's genuinely possible for all the physical facts P to exist without the phenomenal fact Q,
then Q can't be just a consequence of P. It must be something extra.
right. Which means physicalism, the idea that Q is wholly grounded in P, is false.
And the conclusion.
C4. Therefore, physicalism is false. The whole argument stands or falls on defending that tricky transition premise, C2. It relies entirely on that conceivable variation gap, being able to conceive of Q varying, disappearing, while P stays fixed.
It sounds neat, logical. If I can clearly think of it, surely it's possible somewhere, somehow. But I sense this is where the problems start.
Big time. And those problems are exactly what motivates the shift to the second argument.
The inconceivability argument.
Right. I suggest maybe we're focusing on the wrong thing with zombies. The issue isn't primarily about whether we can conceive of P without Q. That's about separation.
Okay.
The deeper, perhaps more fundamental problem, according to I, is the sheer inconceivability of Q arising wholly in virtue of P. It's about the connection, the constitution itself.
So wait, we're shifting from asking, can I imagine a zombie world, P without Q, to asking, can I even imagine how P could possibly produce or be Q in the first place?
Exactly. It's a question about the grounding relationship itself. Can we make conceptual sense of how mere structure and dynamics could constitute subjective feeling?
And the intuition behind I is...
That we can't. That, in principle, it's inconceivable. Take that vivid pink experience again. The idea that this qualia is wholly constituted by colorless, insentient, mathematically described physical interactions, it just seems conceptually impossible to grasp how.
Like trying to build a color out of shapes.
Sort of, yeah. The conceptual ingredients seem wrong.
Okay, let's look at the structure. We'll use Olvi-style again for any collection of purely physical truths.
Okay. Premise 1 is, I1, it is inconceivable that Q holds wholly in virtue of Volts phi.
So this is the core epistemic claim. We just cannot conceive of the grounding connection itself. It relies on an inconceivable grounding gap.
Right. Then comes the transition, premise 2, I2. If it is inconceivable that Q holds wholly in virtue of phi, then it is not the case that Q holds wholly in virtue of false.
So this links the failure to conceive directly to the claim being false. If we can't conceive of it grounding, then it doesn't ground.
That's the move. Then, I3, if Q doesn't hold wholly in virtue of any collection of physical truths, then physicalism is false.
That seems to follow directly from how we defined physicalism.
It does. And finally, I4, therefore physicalism is false.
Before we go further, that phrase wholly in virtue of, we need to be really clear on what that means.
Good point. It's philosophical jargon for metaphysical grounding. It signifies a relationship of constitutive dependence.
Constitutive dependence, meaning?
Meaning one set of facts, the grounding facts, makes the other set of facts, the grounded facts Q, obtain. The grounded facts exist because the grounding facts exist, and in a way that provides a kind of metaphysical explanation. It's about what reality is made of, fundamentally.
Okay, let's try an analogy. The source material used a party example.
Right. You can conceive that a party is happening, holds wholly in virtue of teenagers are dancing, drinking, listening to loud music.
Yeah, that makes sense. The dancing, drinking, music are the party, in a way. They constitute it. The grounding is conceivable, intelligible. Exactly.
Now, contrast that with the pink lump example from the source. Is it conceivable that an object is bright pink wholly in virtue of the fact that it's spherical?
No, not at all. Sphericity is about shape. Pinkness is about color. They seem totally unrelated in that constitutive way.
Precisely. The proposed grounding relation there feels inconceivable because the properties are conceptually mismatched.
The shape doesn't make the color happen.
Right. And the claim of I1 is that the relationship between physical facts and phenomenal facts, Q, is like the pink lump case, not the party case. It's conceptually opaque, maybe even incoherent.
Okay, that distinction is clear. The zombie argument, C, focuses on the possibility of separating P and Q.
The conceivable variation gap.
While the inconceivability argument focuses on the impossibility of connecting P and Q in a grounding relationship.
The inconceivable grounding gap.
Got it. And you're saying this focus on grounding makes I stronger.
That's the core thesis we're exploring. Let's take another example. They use the wiggling worm.
Okay.
Let W be the fact a worm is wiggling. Let M be the incredibly complex description of all the fundamental particles making up the worm and their movements.
Right.
Now, it seems perfectly conceivable that M grounds W. You can understand how the particle movements constitute the worm's wiggle. The grounding itself is intelligible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Particle motion is the wiggle, just described at a different level.
But some philosophers, like mereological nihilists, believe that fundamentally only simple particles exist, and they never truly compose larger objects like worms or chairs.
So they think there's no such thing as a worm, just particles arranged worm-wise.
Exactly. And such a philosopher could argue it's conceivable that M, the particle movements, occurs without W, the worm wiggling, occurring, because for them, there is no worm to wiggle.
So for the wiggling worm, there is a conceivable variation gap. M without W is conceivable for the nihilist, which could be used to attack a C-style argument about worms.
Right.
But there is no inconceivable grounding gap, because the grounding of W by M is itself perfectly intelligible to those who accept worms exist.
Precisely. It shows that the kind of conceptual gap exploited by C, the variation gap, can happen even when the grounding relationship itself is perfectly easy to grasp.
Which suggests maybe arguments based on just conceiving variation are inherently a bit dodgy.
That's the worry. Whereas arguments like I, based on the inconceivability of the grounding connection itself, seem to target a potentially deeper, more robust kind of conceptual failure.
Okay, this is where it really gets interesting then, comparing the two.
Yeah.
We said the big problem for the conceivability argument, C, is its transition premise, C2. The jump from conceivable to possible.
That's the Achilles heel.
And the claim is that I's corresponding premise, I2, inconceivable means false, is much harder to attack.
That's the core comparative claim, because C2 just fails.
Yeah.
Dramatically.
How so?
Well, the simplest version, like if you can conceive it, it's possible. What they call simple CP just doesn't work. Kripke blew that up decades ago with posteriori necessities.
Like water and H2O.
Exactly. I can conceive of a world where the clear, drinkable stuff in rivers isn't H2O. Maybe it's XYZ, like on Twin Earth. It's coherently imaginable.
Sure.
But metaphysically, it's impossible. Water is H2O, necessarily.
Yeah.
So water is not, H2O is conceivable, but impossible. Simple CP fails.
Okay, so zombie proponents needed a fancier version.
Right. They developed 2D CP using two-dimensional semantics. The idea, roughly, is that the conceivability-possibility link works only for concepts whose meaning doesn't shift, depending on the world, concepts that aren't twin-earthable.
And they argued phenomenal concepts like pain or redness are like that. Their meaning is fixed.
That was the argument. But even this souped-up 2D CP runs into really serious counterexamples, specifically concerning metaphysical grounding.
Grounding again.
Yes. And these counterexamples are crucial because they show that even with these non-twin earthable concepts, conceivability can still come apart from possibility.
Okay, let's dig into those counterexamples. Schaeffer's examples, right?
Jonathan Schaeffer, yeah. They're pretty powerful. Take the no-set example.
The sets, like mathematical sets.
Yeah. Most philosophers think that if a concrete thing exists, like, say, Confucius, then the set containing only Confucius must necessarily also exist. It's a basic metaphysical grounding principle. The object grounds its singleton set.
Seems plausible. The set depends entirely on the object.
But now, think about a nominalist philosopher. Someone who believes only concrete particulars exist. No abstract objects like sets are real.
Okay.
That nominalist can surely conceive of a world exactly like ours. Physically, Confucius exists, walking around, etc., but where there are absolutely no sets. None whatsoever.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Just the physical stuff, no abstract mathematical layer.
So the proposition no set, there is no set Confucius, seems ideally conceivable, using just logical and maybe object concepts which aren't twin-earthable. But if set formation is necessary, then no set is metaphysically impossible.
Boom! Conceivable but impossible. A counterexample to 2D CP.
Exactly. And it doesn't involve twin earth or anything like that. Then there's the no-sum example, which might feel even more intuitive.
Composition, like parts making a whole.
Yeah. Most philosophers think that if you have some fundamental particles, some simples, arranged chair-wise, then they necessarily compose a chair. The chair exists purely in virtue of the particles being arranged that way. Composition is usually seen as a necessary grounding relation. But again, think about a different kind of philosopher. A mereological nihilist. We mentioned them with the worm. They think only the simples are real. They never compose anything bigger.
So for them, there are particles arranged chairwise, but no actual chair.
Right. And they can perfectly well conceive of that situation. Simples arranged chairwise, but no composed object, no chair. The proposition no sum is conceivable.
But if composition is necessary, then no sum is impossible.
Another counterexample. Conceivable, yet impossible.
Okay, I see how this damages the zombie argument now.
Yeah.
Because the physicalists defending their view can just point to no set and no sum and say, look, your zombie scenario, P and Q, is just like these.
Exactly.
Sure, you can conceive of the physical facts P without the phenomenal facts Q, but just like you can conceive of Confucius without his set, or particles without the chair, that doesn't mean it's metaphysically possible.
Right. They can argue that psychophysical grounding, P grounding Q, is just another one of these necessary grounding truths that our concepts sometimes fail to track perfectly. Our conceivability outstrips what's actually possible.
So the conceivability argument, C, seems built on shaky ground because its core principle, C2, has these clear counterexamples.
That's the problem. It makes C look unreliable.
So how does the inconceivability argument avoid this fate? How does it sidestep these counterexamples?
This is the really neat part. The strength of I comes from the direction of the potential failure.
Meaning?
The counterexamples that sink, C2, no set, no sum, show the conceivability outstrips possibility. We can conceive of things like no set that aren't actually possible.
Okay.
Now, think about what you need to undermine I2. I2 says, if it's inconceivable that Q is grounded in feel, then it's false that Q is grounded in feeling.
Right. Inconceivable implies false.
To challenge that, you'd need to show the opposite kind of failure. You need to show the possibility outstrips conceivability.
You'd need a true thing that's impossible to conceive.
Exactly. You need to argue that there's some truth about reality specifically. The truth that Phila grounds Q, which is just inherently, fundamentally inconceivable even to an ideal mind. A brute, opaque truth.
That sounds much harder to argue for.
It is, but here's the killer point. Look back at the counterexamples that damaged. C, no set and no sum. What were the underlying truths in those cases?
That Confucius does ground his set, and that particles arranged chair-wise do ground the chair, assuming set formation and composition are necessary.
Right. And are those grounding truths themselves conceivable? Can you conceive of Confucius grounding his set, or the particles grounding the chair?
Yeah, absolutely. We said earlier the grounding in the worm case was intelligible. These seem similar. You can grasp how the parts constitute the whole, or how the object necessitates the set.
Precisely. The grounding principles involved in the counterexamples to C are themselves perfectly conceivable grounding principles.
Ah, I see. So those examples show conceivability sometimes goes wrong, but they do it by relying on underlying truths that are themselves conceivable.
Which means they pose no threat to the principle behind. I2 is about what follows from inconceivable grounding. Since the grounding in no set, no sum is conceivable, those cases don't touch the logic of I.
Wow, okay. So to attack I, the physicalists can't just point to no set. They'd have to make a much stronger, much weirder claim.
They'd have to argue that psychophysical grounding, Philbel grounds Q, is true, but uniquely among grounding relations, it's just fundamentally, irredeemably inconceivable. A truth beyond all possible conceptual grasp.
That seems like a very, very steep hill to climb.
It really does. It makes I look much more secure than C.
Okay, let's spend some time really digging into the premises of I itself then. Starting with I1, the claim that psychophysical grounding is inconceivable.
Sounds good.
You mentioned earlier that proponents of the zombie argument C are actually logically forced to accept I1. That seemed counterintuitive but powerful. Can we walk through that again?
Sure. It shows how interconnected these ideas are. So remember, the C proponent relies on two key things. Some version of the conceivability possibility link, like 2DCP, and ground necessitarianism.
Right, the idea that if A grounds B, it does so necessarily. If P grounds Q, then necessarily P grounds Q.
Okay. Now let's imagine, just for argument's sake, that a C proponent tried to deny I1. Suppose they said, no, actually, psychophysical grounding, let's call it PG, is conceivable.
Okay, so they think we can conceive of P grounding Q.
If they say that, then according to their own principle, 2DCP, if PG is conceivable, it must be metaphysically possible. So, dem and PG. Possible PG.
Makes sense by their rules.
But now bring in ground necessitarianism. PG, if true, is necessarily true. So if PG is even possible, it must be actual and therefore necessary.
Wait, so if TG is conceivable, it must be necessary.
According to the C proponent's own commitments, yes. If PG is conceivable, then it's possible. Since PG entails square P subset Q, if P grounds Q, then necessarily P implies Q, then diamond square P subset Q follows. By standard modal logic, the Brouwer axiom B, or S5, that implies square P subset Q.
Which means P necessarily entails Q. It's metaphysically impossible for P to exist without Q.
Exactly, which means P and Q, the zombie scenario, is metaphysically impossible.
But C1, the first premise of their own argument, requires P and Q to be conceivable and therefore possible.
Precisely. They've just completely contradicted their own starting point. Assuming PG is conceivable leads, via their own principles, to the conclusion that zombies are impossible.
So the only way for a C proponent to avoid shooting their own argument in the foot
Is to accept that psychophysical grounding PG must be inconceivable. They have to accept I1.
Wow. Okay, so anyone pushing the zombie argument is already committed to the first premise of the inconceivability argument.
Logically speaking, yes.
But what about someone who isn't already sold on zombies? What's the independent motivation for accepting I1? Why should someone just looking at the problem think psychophysical grounding is inconceivable?
That takes us back to the intuition we started with, but framed more carefully as the general inconceivability thesis, GIT.
GIT.
GIT argues, quite broadly, that phenomenal truths, like what it's like to see red, simply cannot be conceived to be wholly constituted by any collection of truths that are purely about structure and dynamics.
And structure and dynamics includes, just to remind ourselves,
Spatial or spatiotemporal arrangement, causal roles, nomic structure laws, mathematical and logical structure, and how these change over time. Basically, anything you could put in the equations of physics or describe relationally without mentioning intrinsic qualities.
Okay, so how does GIT support I1?
It uses that intuitive test we touched on earlier, the idea of incremental enrichment. Let's try it with pain again. Start with the simplest physical description. Just the static spatial arrangement of atoms or neurons in a particular brain state associated with pain. Can you conceive of the feeling of sharp, stinging pain being wholly constituted just by that static arrangement?
No, that feels like just a snapshot of where things are. It doesn't capture the ouch.
Right. Now add dynamics. Describe exactly how those atoms are moving, the ions flowing, the electrical potentials changing over time. Does adding the motion, the dynamics, makes the feeling conceivable as being constituted by that physical activity?
Still feels like no. Motion explains why things change position, but it doesn't seem to explain the subjective quality of the feeling itself.
Okay, now layer on the causal structure. Specify the functional role. This neural pattern is caused by tissue damage. It leads to withdrawal behavior. It interacts with attention systems, the whole input-output story. Does knowing the full causal functional role make the intrinsic feeling of the pain conceivable as being constituted by that role?
That's the classic functionalist idea, but intuitively, it still feels like something is missing. You've described what the state does, its relationships, but not what it is like to be in it.
Exactly. The gap persists. And GIT claims it persists even if you describe the physics using incredibly complex, abstract mathematical structures, Hilbert spaces, Lagrangians, whatever. The leap from pure structure and dynamics, however complex, to subjective quality seems conceptually unbridgeable.
It's like structure can only explain more structure, or dynamics can only explain more dynamics. It can explain why neuron A fires neuron B, but not why that firing feels like something.
That's the heart of GIT. It argues the failure isn't just because physics isn't complete yet. It's a mismatch of conceptual categories. Phenomenal properties don't seem to be the kind of thing that could be built out of purely structural or dynamical properties.
Like the pink lump. Shape just isn't the right kind of property to ground color.
Exactly. GIT claims structure and dynamics aren't the right kind of properties to ground qualia. Hence, I1, the grounding is inconceivable.
Okay, that provides a strong, independent reason to consider I1 seriously. Now, what about I2? The transition from inconceivable grounding to false grounding.
Right, I2. If it's inconceivable that Q is grounded in full pia, then it's false that Q is grounded in full pia. This rests on a deep philosophical intuition about intelligibility.
The idea that reality ultimately should make sense. It should be graspable, at least in principle.
Yeah, something like that. The strongest form is, if P is true, then P must be conceivable by some possible ideal mind.
Yeah.
If reality contains truths that are fundamentally, eternally inconceivable, that seems weird, unsatisfying to many philosophers.
So intelligibility suggests that if we genuinely cannot conceive of something, even under ideal reflection, that's good evidence it isn't true. Inconceivability points towards falsity.
Yeah, that's the motivation.
But isn't that a bit strong? What if there are aspects of reality, maybe fundamental properties or laws that are just too alien for any mind, however rational, to fully grasp? Couldn't psychophysical grounding be one of those? A brute, inconceivable fact.
That's the standard objection. An unrestricted intelligibility principle might be too strong. But crucially, to defend I2 in this specific context, the context of physicalism and grounding, we don't actually need the super strong universal principle.
Oh, what do we need?
We only need two much weaker, much more restricted principles. And these are principles that the standard physicalist, and especially the C proponent, would find it extremely difficult to reject.
Okay, what are they?
First, physical intelligibility. If P is a narrowly physical truth about structure and dynamics, then P is conceivable.
That seems hard to deny. Physics deals with precisely the kind of structural, mathematical stuff we expect to be rationally graspable.
Exactly. And remember, the C proponent already assumes P, the conjunction of all physical truths, is conceivable in their premise, C1. So they're definitely committed to the conceivability of individual physical truths.
Okay, physical intelligibility seems safe. What's the second one?
This is the key one, ground intelligibility. If you have a grounding truth, the phi Q, and both the grounding facts and the grounded facts Q are individually and jointly conceivable, then the grounding relationship itself must also be conceivable.
Whoa, okay. Let me unpack that. If the ingredients and Q are conceivable,
And we know their physical facts are conceivable by physical intelligibility, and phenomenal facts Q are certainly conceivable. We experience them.
then the relationship between them, the grounding, must also be conceivable if it's true.
That's what ground intelligibility claims. It basically says grounding isn't some magical, opaque glue. If the things being related are clear, the relation itself should be clear too.
And how does this defend I2?
Well, we know FICO-Q are conceivable. If psychophysical grounding were true, then ground intelligibility says it must be conceivable.
But I1 says psychophysical grounding is inconceivable.
Exactly. So if it must be conceivable by ground intelligibility, if true, but it is inconceivable by I1, then it must be.
False. Which is exactly what I2 concludes.
Right. The argument for I2 only needs physical intelligibility and ground intelligibility.
Okay, but why should we accept ground intelligibility? Why can't grounding be this weird, opaque relationship even when the things it relates are perfectly conceivable? That seems like the physicalist's escape route.
It might seem like an escape route, but rejecting ground intelligibility is actually a really awkward and costly move, especially for someone sympathetic to the motivations behind C.
Why awkward?
Because it means accepting a kind of fundamental explanatory black box right at the heart of reality. You're saying, yes, we can conceive of the physical facts feel, and yes, we can conceive of the phenomenal facts Q, and yes, Phaedo genuinely constitutes Q, but how it does so is just fundamentally, irredeemably inconceivable.
A brute fact of constitution.
A brute, unintelligible fact connecting two perfectly intelligible sets of facts that runs deeply against the grain of physicalism, which is usually motivated by a desire for a comprehensive, intelligible, unified account of the world.
It seems like giving up on explanation at a crucial point.
It does. And what's more, just like with I1, rejecting ground intelligibility might actually be inconsistent with the other commitments a C proponent holds.
How so?
Well, it turns out that ground intelligibility actually follows logically if you accept three other principles that C proponents typically rely on or find plausible.
Okay, what are they?
1, some form of conceivability guiding possibility like 2DCP. 2, strong ground necessitarianism. If A grounds B, then necessarily A grounds B, maybe even necessary across all worlds. And 3, conceivability excluded middle.
Conceivability excluded middle. What's that?
It says that if A and B are individually conceivable, then it must be conceivable that either A grounds B or it's conceivable that A does not ground B. Basically, if you can grasp the potential relata, you can grasp one of the two logical possibilities for their grounding relation.
That sounds almost trivially true. If I can think about A and B, I can surely think about them either being constitutively linked or not.
It seems very hard to deny, right? It would be bizarre to say A and B are conceivable, but both A grounds B and A doesn't ground B are somehow inconceivable.
Yeah, that sounds contradictory.
So if the C proponent accepts their conceivability principle, 1, strong ground necessitarianism 2, and conceivability excluded middle 3, then ground intelligibility follows as the logical consequence.
Which means to reject ground intelligibility and thus escape I2, they'd have to give up one of those three core principles.
Exactly. But giving up 1 or 2 cripples their original zombie argument, C, and giving up 3 seems almost conceptually incoherent.
So the inconceivability argument seems to put the anti-physicalist who likes conceivability arguments in a real bind.
It does. It suggests that if you buy into the general framework of using conceivability against physicalism, you should probably prefer I over C. I's premises, I1 and I2, seem either independently plausible via GIT and intelligibility principles, or actually required by the very logic underlying C.
And crucially, I isn't vulnerable to those damning no set no sum counterexamples that plague C.
Right. It shifts the entire debate away from merely imagining zombies, which seems conceptually suspect, onto the fundamental nature of metaphysical grounding and intelligibility.
The burden really shifts, doesn't it? It's not just on the anti-physicalist to show zombies are conceivable.
Instead, the burden is arguably on the physicalist to explain how psychophysical grounding could possibly be true if it remains stubbornly, fundamentally inconceivable. How can structure and dynamics constitute feeling in an intelligible way?
Okay. So wrap this up. What does this deep dive tell us?
Well, we've seen that these two arguments against physicalism, while related, operate very differently. The classic conceivability argument, C, relies on a link between conceivability and possibility that seems vulnerable to serious counterexamples involving necessary grounding relations.
Like no set and no sum.
Right. Those examples show conceivability can outstrip possibility. But the inconceivability argument flips the script. It argues from the inconceivability of the grounding relation itself to its falsity.
And its key premise, I2, linking inconceivability to falsity, seems protected from those counterexamples because they rely on grounding relations that are themselves conceivable.
Exactly. To attack I, you need the opposite, a case where possibility outstrips conceivability, specifically for grounding. And defending that seems much harder.
So the upshot is that I seems like a much more robust, logically secure argument against standard physicalism than the more famous zombie argument.
That's the philosophical case being made, yes. It focuses on the perceived conceptual mismatch between the physical structure and dynamics and the phenomenal subjective quality, arguing that this mismatch makes their constitutive connection literally inconceivable and therefore false.
The core idea, then, is that if consciousness truly cannot be conceived, even ideally, as being wholly built from purely structural and dynamic physical facts.
And we explored reasons like the general inconceivability thesis, GIT, to think it can't.
Then we have a strong rational reason to think that standard physicalism, as narrowly defined, is not the full story.
It suggests the physicalist framework, limited to just structure and dynamics, is insufficient to account for consciousness. It doesn't necessarily tell us what is true, maybe some form of dualism or maybe a richer conception of the physical itself, but it argues the standard picture is incomplete.
Which leaves us, and leaves you, the listener, with a really challenging final thought to chew on. If consciousness, the what it's like, cannot be intelligibly built up from purely structural and dynamic properties, if that grounding relation remains stubbornly inconceivable, then what else must reality contain? What kind of fundamental properties, perhaps non-structural intrinsic properties, would need to exist for phenomenal grounding to become not just true, but actually conceivable?
What are we missing in our picture of the physical world that prevents us from bridging that gap, from seeing how matter could genuinely constitute mind in a way that makes sense?
That's the question the inconceivability argument leaves us grappling with.